new Cecil B. DeMille's scandalous pre-code epic, but between the sour milk bath that made Claudette Colbert nearly faint, the trained elephants that performed circus tricks instead of killing Christians, and theaters accepting IOUs during the Depression, this biblical spectacular hides secrets wilder than its infamous arena scenes. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about the sign of the cross. Fact 1. The milk bath was actually sour cheese. One of the most iconic and scandalous scenes in The Sign of the Cross features Claudette Colbert as the wicked Empress Poppaea, luxuriating in a bath filled with what was supposedly 500 gallons of wild ass's milk. Cecil B. DeMille proudly announced to the press that they were using genuine ass's milk for authenticity, but the truth was far less glamorous and considerably more unpleasant. The production actually used powdered cow's milk mixed with water to fill the enormous bathtub, which seemed like a practical solution at first. The scene took several days to complete because DeMille wanted multiple camera angles and perfect lighting to capture Colbert's nude form in the milky water. To add a touch of supposed authenticity, 2 kittens were placed near the bath to drink from it, showing audiences that it was real milk. However, nobody on the production team had considered what would happen when all that milk sat in the bathtub overnight under the intense heat of the studio lights. By the second day of shooting, the milk had begun to sour and curdle, essentially turning into cheese right there in the tub, with Colbert still required to climb in and film her scenes. The stench became absolutely overwhelming as the days wore on, filling the soundstage with the unmistakable smell of spoiled dairy. Claudette Colbert, ever the professional, continued filming despite the nauseating conditions, but the odor became so unbearable that she nearly fainted while trying to complete her takes. The crew members working closest to the set also struggled with the terrible smell that permeated everything. Despite these horrific behind-the-scenes conditions, the finished scene became one of the most memorable and talked-about moments in pre-code Hollywood history, cementing its place in cinema legend. Fact 2. Theaters accepted IOUs from broke moviegoers. The Sign of the Cross had one of the most unusual theatrical releases in Hollywood history when it opened nationally on February 10, 1933, right in the middle of what became known as the bank holiday during the absolute worst period of the Great Depression. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared a mandatory closure of every single bank in the United States to prevent a complete collapse of the entire banking system, which meant that nobody in the country had access to cash for several days. Americans couldn't withdraw money from their accounts, cash checks, or conduct any normal banking transactions during this emergency period. Movie theater owners and managers across the nation found themselves facing a terrible dilemma because they had an expensive new epic film ready to show, but their potential audiences literally had no money in their pockets to buy tickets. Rather than simply closing their doors and losing all that potential business, desperate theater managers came up with a creative and unprecedented solution. They began accepting handwritten IOUs scribbled on little pieces of paper from patrons who desperately wanted to see the movie but couldn't pay for admission. These informal promissory notes had no legal backing and were essentially based entirely on trust between the theater managers and their communities. Cecil B. DeMille himself later wrote about this remarkable situation in his autobiography, noting how theater managers took an enormous financial risk by letting people in without any guarantee of payment. The story has a surprisingly happy ending, though, because DeMille reported that when cash began flowing again after the banks reopened, nearly every single one of those IOUs was honored and redeemed by the moviegoers who had written them. This unusual arrangement showed both the determination of Depression-era audiences to escape their troubles through cinema and the remarkable trust and community spirit that existed during those incredibly difficult times. Fact 3. DeMille literally chased John Carradine. Down Hollywood Boulevard, John Carradine's casting in The Sign of the Cross came about through one of the strangest talent discoveries in Hollywood history, involving a literal foot chase down one of Los Angeles's most famous streets. The story goes that Cecil B. DeMille was walking down Hollywood Boulevard one day when he heard an incredibly distinctive and powerful voice coming from somewhere nearby. DeMille immediately stopped in his tracks because he recognized that this was exactly the kind of commanding vocal presence that could work beautifully in the new era of talking pictures. The voice belonged to John Carradine, who at that time was a struggling and unemployed actor desperately looking for any kind of work during the depths of the Depression. When DeMille spotted the source of that remarkable voice, Carradine apparently didn't realize who was trying to get his attention and started walking away. Rather than simply giving up or sending an assistant to track the actor down later, DeMille actually began chasing Carradine down the busy sidewalk, determined not to lose this talented performer. The famous director ran after the unemployed actor until he finally caught up with him and could make his pitch. Carradine must have been absolutely shocked to find one of Hollywood's most powerful and successful filmmakers literally running after him on the street. This bizarre encounter led to Carradine being cast in The Sign of the Cross, where he appears as a condemned Christian martyr on his way to the arena, and his voice can also be heard as both a spectator in the crowd and as a gladiator in different scenes. The relationship between DeMille and Carradine proved so successful that the actor went on to work in a total of 5 feature films for the legendary director, launching what would become a long and distinguished career in Hollywood. Fact 4. Prism lenses created fake crowds. The massive crowd scenes in The Sign of the Cross look incredibly impressive and epic, but they were actually created through clever camera trickery rather than hiring thousands of expensive extras. Cinematographer Carl Struss, who had already won an Academy Award for his work on the film Sunrise, employed special prism lenses that could effectively double the number of people visible on screen through optical illusion. These specialized lenses worked by capturing the same image multiple times within a single frame, making a group of a few dozen extras appear as if there were actually twice as many people filling the arena or crowding the streets of ancient Rome. This ingenious technique was absolutely crucial for the production because Paramount Studios was in serious financial trouble during the Great Depression and simply couldn't afford to hire the massive numbers of background performers that a traditional biblical epic would normally require. DeMille had been given a relatively modest budget of just $650,000 to create what needed to look like a spectacular and lavish historical drama, so every penny had to be stretched as far as possible. Struss combined these prism lens effects with other camera tricks, including shooting from low angles to make small groups of horsemen look like stampeding armies and using careful choreography to fill every inch of the screen with movement and action. The cinematographer also employed miniatures, matte paintings, and strategically designed sets that only showed what the camera would actually see, with nothing built on either side of the action. DeMille himself was famous for knowing how to deceive audiences' eyes, and he worked closely with Struss to ensure that even a modest huddle of people filling the frame would register as a massive crowd in the minds of viewers. The techniques were so effective that Struss received an Academy Award nomination for Best Cinematography for his work on the film. Fact 5. The elephants were too well trained. The climactic arena sequence in The Sign of the Cross featured a menagerie of dangerous animals that were supposed to terrorize and kill the Christian martyrs, but the elephants presented an unexpected and somewhat comical problem for the production crew. Cecil B. DeMille had rented lions, tigers, bears, and elephants from approximately a dozen different zoos across the region to populate the brutal gladiatorial games. And while most of the animals either refused to cooperate or caused other difficulties, the elephants created a uniquely amusing challenge. The massive creatures were supposed to parade slowly and menacingly around the arena floor, creating an atmosphere of dread and danger as they approached their victims, but their previous training as circus performers completely undermined the intended effect. When the elephant handlers led the animals into the arena set, and the crowd of extras began cheering and applauding as they had been instructed to do, the elephants immediately responded to the sound of clapping exactly as they had been trained to perform in circus shows for years. Instead of behaving like threatening instruments of execution, the well-trained elephants began standing on their heads and performing other tricks they associated with audience applause and positive reinforcement. The crew and director found themselves in the absurd position of trying to get performing elephants to stop doing what they had been meticulously trained to do throughout their entire working lives. The gentle nature of these circus elephants actually impressed DeMille in a different way, as he later noted their remarkable consideration and care when they were supposed to pick up bodies of dead Christians, whether those bodies were played by extras or were actually dummies placed on the arena floor. The elephants handled everything with unexpected gentleness, using their trunks with surprising delicacy despite the violent and brutal scene they were meant to be part of. Fact 6. Mary Pickford originally owned the rights. The Sign of the Cross had a long and winding journey to the screen that involved one of Hollywood's most powerful and beloved stars holding on to the property for years before Cecil B. DeMille could finally make his version. The story actually began decades earlier when DeMille was just a child, and his mother took him to see Wilson Barrett's stage play, The Sign of the Cross, which had premiered in 1895 and become a massive theatrical sensation in both America and England. DeMille never forgot the impact that play had on him, and he harbored dreams of one day bringing it to the screen as a grand cinematic epic. The play had already been filmed once before in 1914 by famous players, and DeMille himself later described that version as pretty terrible, even by the standards of early silent films. After that initial film adaptation failed to make much of an impression, the studio sold the rights to the property to Mary Pickford, who was then at the height of her fame as America's sweetheart and one of the most powerful figures in the entire film industry. Pickford held on to those rights for years, apparently seeing potential in the material but never getting around to producing her own version of the story. By 1932, when DeMille desperately needed a hit to revive his flagging career and save Paramount Studios from financial collapse, he finally approached Pickford about purchasing the rights to The Sign of the Cross. The negotiation resulted in DeMille paying Pickford $38,000 for the property, which was a substantial sum during the Depression but represented a crucial investment in what he hoped would become his comeback project. This transaction between two of Hollywood's most legendary figures allowed DeMille to finally realize the vision he had carried with him since childhood. Fact 7. Famous fan dancer Sally Rand was fed to crocodiles. One of the most shocking moments in the arena sequence features a nearly nude woman wrapped only in flower garlands being tied to a post as hungry crocodiles advance toward her, and that unfortunate victim was played by none other than Sally Rand in an uncredited role. At the time of filming in 1932, Rand was just another struggling performer trying to make ends meet during the Depression by taking whatever work she could find. But the following year, she would become an overnight sensation and one of the most famous entertainers in America thanks to her ostrich feather fan dance at the Chicago World's Fair. Rand herself later joked about her career transformation, saying she hadn't been out of work since the day she took her pants off, referring to her scandalous and wildly popular fan dance performances. However, the creatures threatening her character in The Sign of the Cross weren't actually crocodiles at all, despite what the script and promotional materials claimed. The reptiles used in the scene were clearly alligators, which can be identified by their broader snouts and different physical characteristics compared to actual crocodiles. This represents a significant historical inaccuracy because alligators were completely unknown to Europeans until Christopher Columbus and other explorers reached the Americas, which happened roughly 15 centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire when this story takes place. Alligators only exist naturally in two countries in the entire world, the United States and China, and the Romans never traveled to either location or had any knowledge that such creatures even existed. The production presumably used alligators because they were easier to obtain from American zoos and animal suppliers than actual crocodiles would have been, and DeMille likely assumed that most audience members wouldn't know or care about the difference between the two species of reptiles. Fact 8. Charles Laughton made Frederick March very uncomfortable. The on-set dynamics between the film's two male leads created some awkward moments that Frederick March would remember and talk about years later in interviews. Charles Laughton, who played the decadent Emperor Nero with memorable campiness and theatrical flair, was known in Hollywood circles to be homosexual at a time when such matters were rarely discussed openly in public or in the press. March later recalled in conversations with film historian Lawrence Quirk that Lawton's behavior during filming made him extremely nervous and uncomfortable throughout the production. According to March's recollections, Lawton would frequently attempt to look up March's toga costume, which must have created some very awkward situations on a busy film set with dozens of crew members working around them. The Roman costumes worn by the male actors in the film were relatively short tunics that left the legs exposed, so maintaining modesty while moving around the set and performing scenes would have required some careful attention. March admitted that Lawton's persistent attention and behavior always kept him on edge whenever they were working together in scenes. Despite these uncomfortable interactions, March remained diplomatic when discussing his other co-star, Claudette Colbert, who played the seductive Empress Poppaea in the film's most scandalous sequences. When asked about working with Colbert, March enthusiastically described her performance by saying she was a hot woman in the film, a hot woman, emphasizing his words for effect. This comment seemed designed to redirect attention away from the uncomfortable situations with Lawton and toward the more acceptable topic of his attractive female co-star. The contrast between March's obvious discomfort with Lawton and his enthusiastic praise for Colbert reveals the complex social dynamics and unspoken tensions that could exist on Hollywood sets during this era. Fact 9. A Wapwoo prologue made Hitler equal to Nero. When The Sign of the Cross was re-released to theaters in 1944, Cecil B. DeMille personally supervised the creation of an entirely new opening sequence that transformed the 12-year-old film into wartime propaganda. The prologue was set in the present day of World War II and featured American B-25 bomber planes flying over the city of Rome during the Allied campaign in Italy. The new footage showed a group of American airmen having conversations inside one of the bombers as they prepared to drop propaganda leaflets over the Eternal City, with the crew specifically informing Roman citizens that the Allies would only be bombing military targets and not civilian areas. The dialogue between the soldiers featured two military chaplains, one Protestant and one Catholic, who began reminiscing about ancient Rome and the persecution of Christians under Emperor Nero. Through their conversation, the prologue drew explicit and unmistakable parallels between the tyrannical rule of Nero in ancient times and the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler in modern Germany, suggesting that both men represented the same kind of evil and oppression across the centuries. This newly filmed material was extremely expensive, costing somewhere between $100,000 and $125,000 to produce, which was a substantial amount of money to spend on just 8.5 to 11 minutes of additional footage. The prologue featured actor Stanley Ridges in a prominent role, even though he had not appeared anywhere in the original 1932 version of the film. The sequence concluded by transitioning directly into the original film's opening scene. And at the end of the movie, a short epilogue showed the American bombers heading back to North Africa after completing their mission successfully. Fact 10. The lions refused to eat the Christians. The most iconic and historically famous element of the film was supposed to be the scene where lions devour Christian martyrs in the arena, but getting the big cats to perform this gruesome task turned into one of the production's biggest headaches. Cecil B. DeMille and his crew had rented lions from various zoos specifically for these dramatic sequences, and they knew they couldn't actually have the animals attack real people, so they came up with what seemed like a foolproof plan. The special effects team created realistic-looking dummies that were supposed to represent the Christian victims, and then they stuffed these dummies full of raw lamb carcasses, hoping the smell and taste of fresh meat would trigger the lion's natural hunting and feeding instincts. The crew assumed that once the lions got close enough to smell the lamb inside the fake bodies, they would tear into them with the savage ferocity that audiences expected to see from man-eating beasts. Unfortunately for DeMille and his production team, the trained lions from the zoos had absolutely no interest in attacking or devouring the carefully prepared dummies, no matter how much lamb meat was packed inside them. Instead of lunging at the fake Christians with their claws and teeth, the lions simply approached the dummies very calmly, and then proceeded to lap daintily and delicately at whatever blood had seeped out onto the surface. The big cats treated the whole situation more like a casual snack than a violent feeding frenzy, which completely ruined the terrifying atmosphere that DeMille was trying to create for the climactic arena massacre. The lions' refined and almost polite behavior toward their supposed prey created a frustrating situation where the most anticipated scene in the entire movie couldn't be filmed as dramatically or convincingly as everyone had hoped. Fact 11. Famous gorilla man Charles Gomorrah created the gorilla costume. One of the most disturbing and controversial images from the Sign of the Cross shows a gorilla menacingly approaching a nearly naked woman who has been tied to a wooden post in the arena, and the person inside that remarkably realistic gorilla suit was Charles Gomorrah, who would become known as Hollywood's most famous and sought-after gorilla performer. Gomorrah was a Filipino-American makeup artist and costume creator who specialized in creating incredibly lifelike ape and gorilla suits that could fool audiences into believing they were watching real animals on screen. What made Gomorrah's work even more impressive was that he didn't just wear the costumes that other people made. He actually designed and constructed his own gorilla suits from scratch using his extensive knowledge of animal anatomy and movement. For the Sign of the Cross, Gomorrah created the gorilla costume specifically for this production and then performed inside it himself, bringing the character to life through his careful study of how real gorillas moved and behaved. Despite his crucial contribution to one of the film's most memorable and shocking moments, Gomorrah received no credit whatsoever in the final film, which was unfortunately common practice in Hollywood at that time for performers who worked inside costumes or provided special effects. The scene with the gorilla and the helpless woman was extremely controversial and ended up being cut from many versions of the film by censors who found it too disturbing and suggestive, with the implication that the gorilla might either kill or assault the woman, creating significant problems for the censorship boards. Gomorrah would go on to have a long and successful career playing gorillas and apes in dozens of Hollywood films throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, making him one of the unsung craftsmen whose work appeared in countless classic movies. Fact 12. The entire film was shot through red gauze. The Sign of the Cross has a distinctive and unusual visual appearance that sets it apart from other films made during the early sound era, and this unique look was achieved through a bold cinematographic choice by Karl Struss. The talented cinematographer made the decision to shoot the entire black and white picture through bright red gauze filters placed in front of the camera lens, which created a soft, glowing, and almost ethereal quality to every single frame of the film. This gauze filtration technique had the effect of diffusing the light and giving the images a luminous, dreamlike atmosphere that made ancient Rome feel like a half-remembered vision from the distant past rather than a concrete historical setting. Struss himself later explained that he wanted the film to evoke what he called a world remembered, suggesting that the story should feel like it was being viewed through the misty lens of history and legend. The use of gauze filters had been much more common during the silent film era of the 1920s, when cinematographers regularly employed soft focus techniques and diffusion to create romantic and artistic effects. But by 1932, this approach had largely fallen out of fashion as talking pictures embraced sharper and more realistic visual styles. Struss was deliberately choosing to reach back to the aesthetic sensibilities of silent cinema to give the Sign of the Cross a timeless and classical appearance that would distinguish it from the more straightforward look of contemporary films. The red color of the gauze was specifically chosen because it would interact with the black and white film stock in a particular way, softening harsh contrasts while maintaining enough detail and clarity for audiences to follow the action. This creative cinematographic decision contributed significantly to the film's atmospheric power and helped earn Struss an Academy Award nomination for Best Cinematography. Fact 13. DeMille ran out of money mid-take. The Sign of the Cross was being made on an extremely tight budget during the worst years of the Great Depression, and the financial constraints finally caught up with Cecil B. DeMille in the most dramatic